Okay, we are here with topic 4.2, the rise of political parties in the era of Jefferson. So let's get into it. First of all, the rise of political parties. So, as you know from topic 3, which ended with the end of the presidency of John Adams, there was the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien Acts were passed to make it harder for someone to become a citizen of the United States. Most people who were becoming new citizens were supporting Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans, although the Federalists were in office. And so it used to be they would have to wait 5 years in order to become a citizen and start voting. The Alien Acts made it 14 years, and it also made it easier to deport someone who was an alien. Alien means someone from another country. Okay, also the Sedition Acts. This was a huge violation of the First Amendment. It made it a crime to say something negative about the President of the United States. and Interestingly enough, John Adams was very intelligent, very wise, in setting that act to expire at the exact time that his presidency was ending. Okay, so in response to this, Kentucky and Virginia passed resolutions by Democratic Republicans. And here's a quote by Thomas Jefferson: "And every state has a natural right to nullify." So at this time, it was not clear how, in the United States, an unconstitutional law would be nullified. Nowadays, we do it through the Supreme Court. But in the Constitution, something that came along with it was called the Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights said things like, you have the right for a free press. And so the press has freedom of speech. That's the First Amendment. It's nice that that right's in there, but what happens if the government violates it? That wasn't clear. So resolutions of Virginia and Kentucky, they were penned by Madison and Jefferson, and these were resolutions that nullified the Sedition Act in particular. And so that's how the Democratic Republicans responded to the Sedition Acts. So let's take a look at these two parties. This is the first party era, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. On this side is John Adams, and on this side is Thomas Jefferson. Now, and I would actually make a really good argument that I could just as easily, or maybe even more properly, if I was going to make this again, put Alexander Hamilton here instead of John Adams. But the Federalists believe in a strong central government, a strong national government, and the Democratic Republicans want a weak central government. The Federalists want a loose interpretation of the Constitution, meaning that the federal government is allowed to do things that aren't explicitly listed in the Constitution as long as they're necessary and proper to fulfill the things that are explicitly listed. The Democratic Republicans are very strict about their interpretation of the Constitution. The federal government can only carry forth the enumerated powers, and there's about 17 of them. The Federalists are very pro-British. The Democratic Republicans are pro-French. The Federalists believe in a large peacetime military. The Democratic Republicans want a small peacetime military because they think a military could be used to harass the people. And in fact, during these Alien and Sedition Acts, when the legislatures of Kentucky and Virginia were passing these resolutions to nullify the Sedition Acts, one of the things Alexander Hamilton said to John Adams was, hey, do you want me to go down there and occupy these legislatures? But John Adams thankfully said, no, you're going too far. Okay, so that would be their example of large peacetime military and small peacetime military. Favored aid to businesses, and this would be through things like internal improvements, like building roads and canals, and giving out loans through a central bank. Thomas Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans favored agriculture. If you want to know anything about Thomas Jefferson, remember he loved farming. The Federalists favored tariffs. Tariffs are charges that are put on goods coming into the United States from another country. And so these will make those goods more expensive, and it makes American-made products more competitive and makes it easier for American-made products to be bought. Also, tariffs can be revenue tariffs, meaning that they're not so much that it makes those products impossible to be competitive, but they're there to raise money for the government. And that's actually more what the tariffs were like that John Adams and Alexander Hamilton proposed and put on goods were more revenue tariffs that were more moderate, meaning that they didn't completely, for instance, make it unreasonable for Britain to send shoes over to the United States. The shoes that Britain sent were still competitive, but maybe 5 to 10% more expensive than they would be without the tariffs. Okay, the Democratic Republicans opposed tariffs, and the reason for that is that they wanted their goods as cheap as possible. Most of the Democratic Republicans were poor farmers, not Thomas Jefferson, obviously, but the people that they had in mind, poor farmers from the South, or even rich farmers from the South, who did not themselves have factories, or no one in their state had factories. They didn't make processed goods. They made raw goods like tobacco and cotton, and they shipped them off to England or somewhere else where they traded for finished goods. And so because they're trading for finished goods, they want those goods to be cheap as possible. The Federalists, supported by northern businessmen and large landowners, and the Democratic Republicans were supported by small farmers, skilled workers, and plantation owners. So the election of 1800, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr for the Democratic Republicans. And one of the reasons why Thomas Jefferson chose Aaron Burr is that Aaron Burr is from New York, and Thomas Jefferson wants to get some votes in the North. You can imagine that Thomas Jefferson is putting together this Democratic Republican Party, and he's trying to find people from all over the nation to support him, and it's really just to take down Hamilton. And even though John Adams is the one in office, he really looks at it as Hamilton's plans that are turning the country into, in his mind, really a monarchy. And so he thinks that if John Adams becomes the next president, we might have a president for life, and we'll lose our Republican form of government. And so he chooses Aaron Burr, not because Aaron Burr really believes in the beliefs that Thomas Jefferson had that we outlined in the previous slide. It's more like Aaron Burr just really doesn't like Alexander Hamilton. Surprise, surprise. Okay, John Adams and Charles Pinckney for the Federalist. Okay, so what ended up happening is that Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans win 73 to 65. But the way that the voting works is that each of the electors gets 2 votes. And they get 2 votes, and they have to vote for 2 different people, but it's really undistinguished. You don't say, well, 1 vote goes for the president and 1 vote goes for the vice president. You just cast 2 votes, right? And so the idea here is that Jefferson and Burr would win, and Burr would kind of take a back seat and allow Jefferson to be president. But actually, in the Constitution, it says that if there's a tie, it would go to the House of Representatives, and in the House of Representatives, each state would get 1 vote instead of stepping aside. What Burr does, even though he had agreed to be vice president, he says, well, I would like to be president. And he turned to the Federalists and said, hey guys, I'll go ahead and do Federalist stuff if you guys support me. So the Federalists in the House of Representatives support Burr, and everyone else goes with Jefferson, because the Federalists know that there's no way that John Adams and Charles Pinckney can win, so they support Burr. And it goes through something, 36 ballots. And so at the very end of it, what ends up happening is that Alexander Hamilton supports Jefferson. And surprise, surprise, Alexander Hamilton has no trust in Aaron Burr. He thinks Aaron Burr is a really bad person. He thinks that, Thomas Jefferson is a decent person. Although he disagrees with everything Thomas Jefferson believes about politics, at least he thinks he's a good guy. And he thinks that if we give the presidency to Aaron Burr is going to do something crazy like declare himself emperor for life and call himself like Aaron the First or something like that. And so he thinks we're going to lose everything if we give the presidency to Aaron Burr. So he convinces New York to cast its vote for Thomas Jefferson. And there's a real problem here because the Constitution doesn't have any mechanism for if a tie, if there's a tie in the House of Representative votes. And so if this just kept on going on and on and on, nobody knew what would happen. Would it be Adams would just stay president because no one chose a new one? And so Alexander Hamilton intervened, and he convinced New York to cast its vote for Thomas Jefferson, and you can imagine that that Alexander or Aaron Burr is not very happy about this because he's not going to be president. And then because he stabbed Thomas Jefferson in the bank, he's going to kind of be isolated as vice president. Even though he gets to be vice president, he's going to be very isolated. He doesn't get invited to cabinet meetings and such. So Jefferson described the election as being a real revolution in the principles of our government, as that of 1776 was in its form. Not effected indeed by the sword as that, but by the rational and peaceable instrument of reform, the suffrage of the people. So suffrage just means voting, meaning this, that when power in government would switch from one party to another party at this time, all throughout the world, there would often be violence. Now, it could just be easy for the Federalists to say, hey, we're going to get some guns and we're going to fight the Democratic Republicans because we're not going to give up our place. But they didn't do that. There was a peaceful transfer of power. It was a revolution in a sense that power changed hands, but peacefully as the Constitution intended. And John Adams had left D.C. before Jefferson was sworn in. Okay, so now we're going to go to the Louisiana Purchase. So Jefferson's vision of our nation was a nation of small farmers. So we have an area called the Louisiana Territory. It's kind of west of the Mississippi, and it was owned by Spain. Remember, Spain got that territory from France at the Treaty of Paris, at the end of the French and Indian War. But France kind of forces Spain to give it back, and so Spain transferred Louisiana back to France. And here, the Pinckney Treaty could be repealed. Remember, the Pinckney Treaty was a treaty that was signed with Spain that allowed the United States to use the Mississippi for transport and to use the port of Louisiana to send goods out. Remember, at this time, if you grow crops, they're going to have to be transported along water and not along a road, because there weren't very many good roads, and then pulling things with a horse just cost too much money and all of your profit would be dried up. So now the U.S. needed to access the New Orleans for trade. So Napoleon was dealing with the Haitian Revolt and the impending war with Britain. So Napoleon's whole idea of wanting the Louisiana Territory was this. Okay, so in Haiti, which was a French colony, Haiti had the right climate to produce sugar. Sugar has to be grown in an area that has a climate that never freezes, because as soon as sugar cane freezes, the crop is completely destroyed. So in Haiti, it has the perfect environment to farm sugarcane. But the problem is that it's very labor intensive, and it requires a lot of human labor. And so they had slaves working on this, maybe 500,000 slaves, but those people need to be fed. And so you're going to need to take about 3/4 of the land and use it to grow crops, and then only 1/4 of the land can be used to grow sugar. And so if you could grow the crops somewhere else, let's say in the Louisiana Territory, ship them down the Mississippi, and send them on to Haiti, all of Haiti could then be used to grow sugar. And then what Napoleon planned to do was to take the money from the sugar, build up a big army, and defeat Britain. And so what happened was there was a revolt, a really, really nasty revolt in Haiti, a slave uprising, and Napoleon was going to go put down the slave uprising. His forces didn't accomplish anything. They were badly beaten, first of all, by disease. And so he lost Haiti. And because he lost Haiti, now he does not need the Louisiana Territory. And so these agents in the United States go, like James Monroe and Stephen Livingston, and they're trying to negotiate to buy just one place, just New Orleans, and Napoleon for up to $10 million. Napoleon says, "Heck, I'll sell you the whole thing right here for $15 million." And so this is a really great deal. And so they just take the deal. They don't even ask Jefferson if they can spend more money because they think it's such a great deal that they just have to take it. So this, so according to Republicans, government can only do what's in the Constitution, and Jefferson was a Democratic Republican. You can also call Democratic Republicans Jeffersonian Republicans. So the Constitution doesn't make any mention of the U.S. being able to purchase territory from another nation by treaty. And so because that's not in the Constitution, Jefferson has a sort of a crisis of conscience because remember, he believed in strict interpretation of the Constitution. And so this becomes, a lot of people paint this as something where Jefferson is betraying his ideals. I don't really think it is because it was well known at this time that treaties could be made and the Constitution that transferred land from one nation to another. The Treaty of Paris transferred a lot of land from Britain to the United States that the United States did not have before the Treaty of Paris. And so the Constitution says that the president has the power to negotiate treaties or to send other people under him to negotiate treaties. And that's what happened here in the United States, got land. And so I think the people who make a big deal about this and call Jefferson a hypocrite are going a little bit too far because the Constitution does allow there to be treaties, and it is common for land to be transferred from one nation to another nation through treaties. Okay, so we have the Louisiana Purchase here. This whole territory needs to be explored. So we have Lewis and Clark that are going to explore. They're going to leave St. Louis, Missouri in May of 1804. They're going to follow the Missouri River, explore it up the Rocky Mountains and the Columbia River. And here is Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. So Sacagawea, she's a Shoshone wife of translator Toussaint Charbonneau, and I really don't know how to say French names, were very helpful, and they proved their peaceful intentions. And so there's going to be a couple of different things that happen here. So this is a Fort Dakota in 1804 to 1805, and here's another fort that was built along the Columbia River in Oregon in 1805 to 1806. And basically the idea here is that the United States wants to know what it got in the Louisiana Territory. It wants to establish peaceful relations with the Native Americans who live here. And so that's the reason why Thomas Jefferson sends this. They're not the only ones. Lewis and Clark are not the only ones. There's also Zebulon Pike in the southern part of the Louisiana Territory. So what did they do? They documented new plants and animals, and how could the area be exploited for commerce. So Jefferson thinks there might be some like crazy animals over here. So on his farm, he finds bones from like these huge maybe mammoths or something like that that used to live like millions of years ago or tens of thousands of years ago. And Jefferson thinks, well, maybe these are animals that still live in the in the Louisiana Territory. And so they don't find anything like that. So they established diplomacy with native tribes. They created maps that laid additional land claims. And here you can see some of the pictures they drew of different animals. Then there's some Supreme Court decisions during this time. So Jefferson comes into office, and there was something called, as he was coming in, there was something called the Judiciary Act of 1801. And this is, obviously Jefferson comes into office in 1801. And so what happens is as the Federalists are going out of office, they pass this Judiciary Act that creates 16 new judicial appointments on the federal circuit. So there's dozens of new justices of the peace. And also it reduced the Supreme Court from 6 to 5, so Jefferson couldn't fulfill the big vacancy. So what happened here with Marbury versus Madison? So the decision, it's right here for Marbury versus Madison. What you really need to know is that as John Adams was leaving, there was something called the Midnight Judges. And so John Adams is signing these commissions on the very last day of his presidency, and you can imagine him being at his desk signing these commissions, establishing these new 16 judges, and there's some of them that he's not able to get to until the very last day. And so it would be the job of the Secretary of State to deliver the commission to the judge. And so John Adams, the outgoing Federalist president, he signs these commissions and puts them on the desk of the incoming Secretary of State, who is going to be James Madison. And so, but when Jefferson comes into office, remember, he really does not like the Federalist judges. So he and Madison are going to decide we are not going to deliver these commissions. And so one of those commissions was for Stephen Marbury. Here, this guy. And so Stephen Marbury never gets his commission. And so part of the Judiciary Act, I think of 1789, which was the initial Judiciary Act that established the federal district courts and the circuit courts. This one just expanded it, but it still kept the core provisions of it. One of those said that if any part of the act isn't followed, the Supreme Court can issue a writ of mandamus, and it can force somebody to fulfill whatever aspect of that law is not being fulfilled. So Stephen Marbury approaches the Supreme Court. He goes directly to the Supreme Court, asks for a writ of mandamus. At this time, the Supreme Court is dominated by Federalists, particularly the Federalist judge, the fourth Chief Justice of the United States, John Marshall. John Marshall surprises everyone by, in some ways, giving Thomas Jefferson and James Madison what they want. He does acknowledge that Stephen Marbury, the judge, according to the law, should get his appointment. However, what they're going to say is that law is unconstitutional because it expands the power of the Supreme Court, because nowhere in the Constitution does it say that the original jurisdiction of the Supreme Court involves things like issuing writs of mandamus. And so they said you cannot, by an act of Congress, expand the power of a branch of the federal government unless that's by amendment. And this was not an amendment. This was just an act of Congress. And so what the Supreme Court is going to say is that, well, okay, but he's not, even though he deserves it according to this law, the portion of the law that says that is unconstitutional, therefore he's not going to get it. Yay for Jefferson. He's high-fiving everybody because he got what he wanted. But something happened. Remember, Jefferson thought that the way that unconstitutional laws should be annulled, or that they should be struck down, was through states annulling them, through states passing laws saying that they're unconstitutional. And now the federal government is going to do that. And so Jefferson does not like the federal government to grow in power because he thinks it can become tyrannical. Nevertheless, this happens, and after this, we have this principle of judicial review, meaning that now if something like the Sedition Acts does happen, someone can sue, it'll go to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court can say that the law is unconstitutional. And you can pause the video and look at this little comic strip. So here are some other Supreme Court decisions. One of them is McCulloch versus Maryland. This is concerning the Second Bank of the United States. So the Second Bank of the United States, the first one ended up, its charter was for 20 years, and it expired, and they built a new one, the Second Bank of the United States, and they built a branch of that bank in Maryland, and Maryland tried to tax that bank, and they tried to put a tax on the federal government. And so McCulloch, he was like the head of that bank at that time, which was called a cashier, he sues Maryland, and he says, we are not going to pay this tax. And John Marshall agrees with him because he says the power to tax involves the power to destroy. And if states could tax the federal government, and let's say the federal government didn't have enough money to pay those taxes, then the states would be in a position to destroy the federal government, and that would go against the Supremacy Clause. And so what it says was, and because the Supremacy Clause makes the federal government supreme over state governments, the state governments cannot tax any branch of the federal government. Now, the federal government will do things like give payments in lieu of taxes. Let's say they build a big new courthouse in a downtown area of a city where a bunch of businesses could have been built, and those businesses would have brought in tax revenue. Sometimes the federal government will pay the states, but not because they have to. Okay, so that expanded the federal government over the states. Another one was Dartmouth College, first Woodward, and so this one is the idea that contracts must be honored. And so what happened was Dartmouth College was a private college and it had a contract making it a private college. And the state that it was in tried to make it part of the state colleges and basically tried to nationalize it at a state level, meaning that the government would take over. And the Supreme Court ruled no, that if Dartmouth in its contract with the people who established it say that it's a private college, the state cannot annul that contract, so the contract must be honored. And so that took away power from the state. Another one is Gibbons versus Ogden. And so this is that Congress controls interstate trade. So basically, a state was trying to control interstate trade, and Congress was also trying to control interstate trade along the same route, and only one of them could control it. And so this Congress was allowed to control interstate trade. Okay, relations with European powers. So there was let me see. So there's these Barbary pirates in Tripoli that were that would attack merchant vessels. And before Thomas Jefferson came into power, John Adams and the other president, George Washington, would just pay tribute to these pirates, basically bribing them to not attack ships with an American flag on them. And so, to make a long story short, Thomas Jefferson, this goes against his principles, and the payments end up being a rather large portion of the federal government's budget. So Thomas Jefferson doesn't want to pay it, but that doesn't go well. He tries to send he tries to send American vessels over there. That doesn't work out so well. It kind of works out. But they end up just paying the tribute, and that's what ends it. Okay, so there was that. There's also relations with European powers. So at this time, Britain was continuing to impress Americans. So they would stop merchant ships, and here's a picture of the British taking American sailors and forcing them into the British Navy. What the British would say would be these were deserters from the British Navy. Also, Britain did not leave the frontier in the along the Ohio and Mississippi River. Britain did not leave that area, and they were supplying Native Americans with weapons. And so there were war hawks in Congress who said that we should declare war, and the Federalists were opposed to this war. And that is it.